This presentation is brought to you by American Civil War and UK History. This is the Figures of the American Civil War podcast. If you're watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please remember to hit the subscribe button. And all the links to our website, podcast and social media pages can be found in the podcast description. Hello, I'm your host Daz, and in this episode I'm joined by Bertram Hayes Davis, who is a direct descendant of the figure of the Civil War we are going to discuss today. The man in question will start life in Fairview, Kentucky, will attend West Point in 1824, and in 1846, at the outbreak of the American-Mexican War, will raise a regiment of volunteers, the 1st Mississippi Regiment for the United States Army. He will go on to have a very successful political career, first as a senator, then in 1853 becomes Secretary of War. At the outbreak of the American Civil War, he will return to his home state of Mississippi and was chosen to become the President of the Confederate States of America. We are going to be discussing Jefferson Davis. This is the Figures of the American Civil War podcast, Jefferson Davis. And welcome everyone, and a very warm welcome to Bertram. Welcome, Bertram.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Excellent. So again, as I've said in the intro, we're going to be discussing Jefferson Davis today, and Bertram Hayes Davis is a direct descendant of Jefferson Davis. So there's no one better educated and knows more about Jefferson Davis than this guy. So would you please start, Bertram, with a little bit of family background of Jefferson Davis's family, please?
Jefferson Davis is a very interesting gentleman in reference to his genealogy. He's actually a descendant of three brothers who came over from Wales in the 1700s, and one of them got married, had a child, and the next one is Samuel Davis, who is my third great-grandfather. And Samuel Davis is actually the one who is the father of Jefferson Davis. So we go back. Matter of fact, my aunts spent a lot of time in London and in England and traced the Davis lineage back to the 600s or the 500s or something. So we're old-time English.
Nice one. Excellent. I like to hear that. That's good. So could you tell us a little bit about his birth and where he was born and his early life?
Well, ironically, Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln were both born in the same state. America doesn't really know that. They assume that Davis was born in Mississippi and Lincoln was born in Illinois, but that's not the case. They were both born in Kentucky. Jefferson in 1808 and Lincoln in 1809, about 175 miles, or about 250 kilometers from one another in English terms. And the Davises moved to Mississippi when Jefferson was 2. The Lincolns obviously moved to Illinois when Lincoln was a young man, much older than 2 when they moved. I always tell the joke about when they left, if the Lincolns had to turn left and gone south and the Davises had to turn right and gone to Illinois, the whole world would have been a little bit different.
Well, that would have been upside down, wouldn't it? That's fantastic. I love that. Yeah, that's great. Sorry, carry on, mate.
So the Davises get here in 1810. They're going to go through Louisiana. They first tried a homestead at a place called Bayou Teche. I stood there about 2 years ago, and in about an hour I had 15 mosquito bites. And they decided it wasn't very hospitable either, so they moved to Mississippi. They moved to a town called Woodville. Woodville's a little bit halfway between Natchez, Mississippi, and St. Francisville, Louisiana. And that is the family home. It's called Rosemont Plantation, and that's where they're going to be. Matter of fact, the home has been restored to the 1840s, and we have our family reunions at that same location. So that's where Jefferson's going to call home for his growing up period of time.
Awesome. Could you tell us a little bit about his early education? Was he a good boy at school? Did he pay attention? Things like that.
I failed to mention that Jefferson was the 10th of 10 kids. He was the youngest of all of his siblings.
So he got the dirty bathwater then, basically.
Yes. But because he's the youngest boy, he's going to be the one that gets the benefit of all the labors of his father. And his father's concerned about his education as well. And when he's 8 years old, his father arranges for him to attend a private school in Lexington, Kentucky. That's 795 miles from Woodville, with a contingent of friends of his from the Revolutionary War. And they're going to go up the Natchez Trace, which is a notorious road. I mean, it's full of robbers and Indians and the whole thing, but they do get there. He's gonna go to school at the age of 8. And on the way, he's gonna stop and visit Andrew Jackson at his home because the gentleman with him had served under Jackson in the Revolutionary War. And he's going to spend a couple of weeks with Andrew Jackson at the age of 8. And he writes in his memoirs that it was such a significant time because Andrew Jackson is aware of what the country's going to be. I mean, he knows what it's going to be, and he's expounding upon that, and that sticks with Jefferson. But he goes to private school in Lexington, and he's going to be there for 2 years, and then he's going to come back to Mississippi. But when he comes back, he's not going to be on a horse anymore. They arranged for him to be on a steamboat, one of the first steamboats on the Ohio and Mississippi River. He says it's like the Concorde. People would get on and ride 10 miles and get off just to say they rode the steamboat. Going to come back to Mississippi, and his formal education will continue in Mississippi. He goes to Jefferson College for a while, and he goes to Wilkinson Academy, and he meets one of those teachers that we've all had that was tough. And he comes home one day to his dad and says, "School's just too tough. I don't want to go back." And Samuel says, "Fine, come out in the field and work with us." So he does that day. He does the second day, and towards the end of the second day, he goes to Samuel and said, "School's not so bad. I think I'll go back." So that was his early formal education in reference to that.
Awesome. Okay, so he had a great education then, basically, and so but he does end up at West Point, doesn't he? So just tell us a little bit about his time at West Point and how he does there.
Well, he is actually at a school in Kentucky again, at Transylvania College. Before that, his brother had decided that he would send him there. His brother Joseph is 24 years older, and he's going to take control of Jefferson's life. But Jefferson didn't really like that school, but he thought he was going to be there. But in the middle of that, Joseph and his father Samuel decide that the best education is at West Point. So they get him an appointment to West Point. Interesting, though, between the time the appointment arrives and the time he's supposed to move to New York, Samuel, his dad, passes away. And Jefferson's devastated by that. He just can't believe it. He's not home to see it. So he writes a letter to John C. Calhoun, who is Secretary of War, which is over West Point, and says, "I'm coming, but I'm going to be late." And late he was. He shows up 2 or 3 weeks after the curricular starts, and they ask him who he is when he walked in the door. And he says, "I'm Jefferson Davis. I'm supposed to be here." And he says, "Well, you have to take an entrance exam because you're late." And he said, "Well, what will be on that test?" And he'll say there'll be reading and writing and math. Now, taking advantage that Jefferson had a great education, but it was all liberal arts. It's the classics, it's language and whatever. There's no math, very little. So they do give him a textbook, and the next day the test is given. And the question that was asked was in geometry. And somehow or another, he had learned enough in those few hours of looking at that math that he was able to tell him that he knew something about geometry, and he was allowed to attend. He will be there some of the times that he had a whole lot of fun. And you're not supposed to have fun at West Point, but he made friends with upperclassmen, and they used to go down to Benny Havens and have a little hard cider. And one night they do get caught. He's court-martialed. But at the court-martial, he tells them that he has to have a witness to him drinking. And no one can say that they ever saw Jefferson Davis take a drink, because at Benny Havens, when any of them would take a drink, they would turn their back. So nobody ever saw him take a drink. There was no proof. So he was not court-martialed, but he was putting on a whole lot of reprimand. That didn't stop him. He went back to Benny Havens more than once. And one night he's going to Benny Havens, he falls off the cliff. This is the cliff of the Hudson River, slams into a tree. He's in the infirmary for about 4 months. He almost didn't survive that fall.
Wow.
The other notoriety of it is that there was a tradition at West Point that no one went home at Christmas. And at Christmas, they would make grog in one of the rooms. Highly illegal, but they'd make it anyway. So on Christmas Eve, they're making the grog, and Jefferson hears that the faculty's after him. He runs into the room and he says, "Boys, put away the grog, the faculty's coming." And the next voice behind him is, "We're right behind you." Now, Davis gets 368 demerits in 4 years in West Point. However, this is the only night that he obeyed the order. He went back to his room and went to sleep, because an hour later there was a riot of the faculty and the cadets, and a third of the class was expelled because of the eggnog riot of West Point.
Excellent story. I love that. Wow. So yeah, he was a yeah. Anyway, right. So what about his early? So he obviously he leaves West Point, doesn't he? Does he go straight into the military and have sort of like a little bit of a military career before his political career?
He's going to serve in the United States Army for 8 years. He's going to be in the Wisconsin territories. He's going to end up in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, on the Mississippi River. He is also responsible for building Fort Winnebago. However, at Fort Crawford, he's going to fall in love with Colonel Zachary Taylor's daughter, Sarah. He goes to Zachary and he asks for her hand in marriage, and the answer's no, not going to happen. Not only is it no, the next orders he gets is shipped him off to Arkansas. Out of sight, out of mind. But it doesn't work. A year later, they elope in Louisville, Kentucky, and he resigns from the military.
Okay, so what's next for him then after the military career? Is it does he go into planting? Is that right?
Well, he gets married with Sarah, and they come back to Mississippi and visit all their brothers and sisters, and they get to St. Francisville at his sister's house. They both get malaria, and she dies 91 days later. So
wow.
Jefferson then relocates to Vicksburg. That's where his brother is, Joseph. And he's going to be with Joseph here for 8 years on Davis Bend, building his plantation and studying law. Joseph gets tired of seeing him, arranges for a lady by the name of Rena Howe to come up from Natchez, and they're going to get married. To get to Natchez, he gets on a riverboat, which are like taxi cabs back then. And arbitrarily, he gets on a boat to go get married, and Zachary Taylor is on the boat. Not happy with Jefferson, but they reconcile, and it will change both their lives. Jefferson does come back, gets married, comes back to Vicksburg, and throws his hat in the political ring. In 1843, he's elected to the United States House of Representatives, and he goes to Washington, D.C.
Wow. Wow. I mean, this is just early in his life as well, isn't it? And there's so much more to come yet.
Yes.
But yeah, one thing that does happen is the Mexican-American War. So what sort of role does Jefferson play in that? Obviously, I know you said that he goes for his political career. Is that so? That's before the Mexican-American War. But what happens at the outbreak of that war?
Jefferson actually comes back to Vicksburg at the outbreak of the war. He convinces President Buchanan to give him the newest armament, which are these very good carbines. He brings 1,000 of his closest friends from Vicksburg. They become the Mississippi Rifles, and he goes to the war in Mexico, and he serves under General Zachary Taylor.
Wow.
Now, they first go to Monterey, and it's hand-to-hand combat. He comes out of that kind of a okay guy. But the big battle was Buena Vista, and in Buena Vista, Davis and his group is one of the units responsible for turning defeat into victory against Santa Anna. And Jefferson will come back as a hero from that war. He was wounded at that battle, and so would Zachary Taylor. And Zachary Taylor becomes president of the United States. Davis comes back, and he is appointed a senator and goes back to Washington, D.C.
Wow. Yeah, I was going to ask that. And also Secretary of War at some point, is that correct?
Well, after that stint in time, he is in Washington for 2 years with Zachary. And Taylor dies in office, and Davis comes back here. That's about 1849. Everything's good in Mississippi until 1852, when Franklin Pierce is elected president, and he asked Davis to join his cabinet. So Davis does go back to Washington as Secretary of War, which is our Secretary of Defense today. He's going to serve in that capacity for 4 years, 53 to 57. Wow. 3 things he's going to do of importance. He's going to modernize the military. He's also going to be in charge of all the surveys for the transcontinental railway from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. Every one of those maps has his approval on it. But his big contributions to the United States was the Capitol building expansion. It was being expanded to two wings, the dome and the statue. And because it fell under the Army Corps of Engineers, Jefferson Davis approved the plans, the material, the engineer, the architect, and the artist for the expansion of the two wings, the dome, and the Statue of Freedom is solely Jefferson Davis's appointment on the Capitol of the United States of America.
Wow, that's awesome. What a lineage to have. Okay, so we're going to start building up to the American Civil War now. And of course, as we know, and a lot of the viewers and listeners will know that Jefferson Davis is one of the biggest people to be involved in the American Civil War. But what are his political views building up to secession and, things like that? Especially the fact that he's actually part of the government,
Prior to the war, in those years before, he realized that we had a problem, and America's not aware of it. By 1850s, the political atmosphere's changed. You either be an abolitionist or a slaveholder. There's no middle ground here, and the abolitionist movement becomes the Republican Party, and that's really one of their things that they're holding on to. So by the time he gets back to the Senate in 1857, he's trying to compromise because he realizes something that perhaps most of those folks in the North don't. There's 3.9 million slaves in the South. And instantaneous freedom of those slaves is going to be a difficult thing for the country to absorb because they don't have any education. They don't know anything. Now, the slaves on Davis Bend have been given these things. They've been given self-governments and business and education and religion. So he knows how long it takes for them to integrate into our society. He's been doing it for 20 years. He realizes there's got to be an interim faction to bring this population in. So compromise is necessary. Instantaneous freedom will not work. However, it never does happen because the movement is so strong. So when Mississippi does secede, he comes back here to Vicksburg, and he's not in Montgomery during the Constitutional Convention where the country's found. And they actually have a candidate for president there, but they don't really think he's got a high moral ground. He has a little drinking problem. So they think of their second choice, which is Jefferson Davis, not even in Montgomery. And then they send a telegram to him right here in Vicksburg on February the 10th, 1861, announcing that he's president of the Confederate States of America. So I'm sitting in the town that he became president in, literally.
Wow, awesome. And also to play such a significant role in the Civil War eventually in 1863, as we know. But so do you think their choice of electing him as president of the Confederate States is because of his time in office in Washington? Is that part of it, and his experience there? Do you think that's why they sort of elect him?
I think that had a lot to do with it. I mean, he was the strongest senator, and he was a proponent of slavery. There's no question, but he wanted it to end, but not in the time that he wanted. He knew what it was going to take. So his position was that he was probably the best choice that they had for it because of his experience. However, his personality probably got in the way a little bit during his presidency.
Yeah, as we'll find out, I'm sure. Okay, just tell us a little bit about his inauguration. Was it a big celebration like they had in Washington for Lincoln, or anything like that? Was a fanfare out and stuff like that?
It was a huge celebration in Montgomery, Alabama, and there were thousands of people there, more than they had thought about. And so they had a great inauguration. He made a speech on the Capitol Rotunda and said that. Matter of fact, there's a star there on that building where he stood and took the oath of office, and I've stood on that star many times.
Awesome. And so what was the decision behind moving the capital from Montgomery to Richmond? What was the idea behind that?
Virginia was neutrality. Virginia had not committed either way in 1861. They were still deciding what they wanted to be. And of course, Washington, D.C. is right just across the river. It's not very far away. However, at Fort Sumter, when that event happened, Virginia said that we will not allow the North to overcome us like they did at Sumter. They did secede. And because Virginia was the richest, most populous state, Davis kind of said, we need to be in the richest, most populous state and give them that scenario. I think the other thing, though, I'm not sure. It's 90 miles from Richmond to Washington. I've driven
Yeah,
it many times. And I
yeah.
think the South was kind of thumbing their nose almost at the Union, saying, here we are, come get us.
Yeah, yeah, I get you there. And of course, they couldn't. It took them a
That's
long
right.
time, didn't it? Yeah, so
Took them for
that's
you.
great. So one thing he does do at the beginning, isn't it, is he leans on, obviously, once Robert E. Lee turns down becoming commander of the Union Armed Forces, he then obviously gives Lee a role with inside well, is it the cabinet or the Confederate Cabinet, or he gets a role, doesn't he? Sorry, you could probably explain a little bit better than me, but just explain his thoughts on Robert Lee and bringing him in to, be part of his team there.
When Lee decides to join the South, Davis brings him to Richmond. And he's part of his cadre. He's not on the cabinet. He's kind of a senior military advisor.
I
But
see.
his role is not instrumental in guiding any of the armies. He isn't in charge. He's not a commander in chief or anything like that. He's kind of a military advisor through the first months of the war. That all is going to change in the Peninsula Campaign when all of a sudden he needs to be there and Davis puts him into the field. He wasn't in the field when the war started out. He was just kind of a military advisor to the president. But when he got to the field, it changed the whole perspective.
Yes, awesome. And as we know, yeah, it's amazing. So now President Jefferson Davis has some, good relationships with some of his generals, but not so good. One thing because of his military background and everything, I've heard that he liked to sort of get quite involved, didn't he, with the way the war was going and get his view across. So I'd like you to talk about a little bit about his relationship with some of his generals and that sort of thing.
He knew them all. I mean, he's Secretary of War. They're all in the Army. Every one of them, he knew them very well. He had his choice of appointments and how he structured them, but he had his favorites. And his favorites are going to linger more than sometimes they should. And he's also going to have his enemies early on. One of his favorites was Albert Sidney Johnson, one of his upper class friends from West Point. He gave him the highest rank in the Army. He was the Jefferson's pick. But we had another John by the name of Joe Johnson. And Joe Johnson, when the war broke out, was the senior in grade military man. However, he was placed third, not first and not second, but third. And that agitated him. From the moment that it happened, it's kind of like putting a chip on your shoulder. And as the war goes on, that chip becomes the size of a Volkswagen. It is going to bother Joe the whole time that he's there. The other thing that Davis had to contend with is the egos. We have a large egotistical cadre of giants. I mean, we have Joe Johnson, we have PTT Beauregard, we have Albert Sidney Johnson. But what the Confederacy lacked that the Union had was command and control. Now, there's a lot of misinterpretations about who calls what, anything at all. But even on the Union side, if you read about McClellan and all those generals early in the war, there was a complete breakdown of communications and following orders. Davis might issue an order and the general might say, I don't like that idea, and do something completely different. Braxton Bragg was one of those favorites of his, and Braxton Bragg was one of those folks that people said, you should get rid of him about a dozen times. He did it once or twice, and it just happens. Joe Johnson became known as Defend and Retreat Joe Johnson. Never did attack. He kept his army intact, but he never did lose an army because he never attacked. He was one of those generals. So Davis had a relationship with most of them, but his favorite was Albert Sidney Johnson. And after his death, he kind of watched Bragg a lot, didn't like Johnson, some of the other ones of notoriety, but he he really wanted to be a general. So that was one of his problems.
Yeah, and you can't be both, can you? No. And so bring up Robert E. Lee again, but I'd like to know because they seem to get on okay, don't they? Jefferson Davis and Lee. They seem to be on sort of the same wavelength most of the time. So what was their relationship like?
Robert E. Lee said, and Davis agreed, they never disagreed about anything during the entire war. Now, that's a pretty bold statement because Davis is very somewhat difficult to get along with. I mean, it's his way or the highway, but Lee is one of those people that he listened to. And Lee had a lot of great ideas that came to pass. Like, he said on the Peninsula Campaign, our defensive positions are not going to win this war. We have to attack. And so he did. The Union was completely unprepared for that. Lee is also the one that says we need to invade. We need to tell them we're coming their way. He went through Pennsylvania and Maryland on those campaigns. He was the one that really took the fight up. So Davis listened to him almost to the letter and never disagreed with him at all. They had a very strong relationship.
Yeah. So as the war went on, um, how did Jefferson Davis his confidence how did he feel confidence wise about the Confederacy? Did he start to wane in confidence as time went on?
Not at all. Matter of fact, he never did that. He was always the president and he always was going to carry forward. Even as the war was winding down, there's a marvelous book written called April 1865. If you have not read it, you need to read it. It's the month that changed the world, changed the United States dramatically. But even during that time, as he left Richmond on his 40 some odd day flight, he always said, we're still a nation, we're still going to be a nation, and he never gave up on it, even to the last day before he was caught.
Okay, awesome. And so, what I would love to ask is how the Southern population viewed Jefferson Davis throughout different periods of the war. So from the beginning to sort of like to what they viewed him towards the end. Did they still have the same feeling towards him as far as from the beginning to the end?
I think the South was unified behind their president as a majority. There was also going to be some, as there are anytime, you're going to have that negative voice. There were newspaper articles, there were politicians against the president. There's nothing that you can do about that. But at the end of the war, when Davis is imprisoned and things happen, I think the South acknowledged that he was the best that they could probably ask for what he did.
Definitely, 100% agree with that. And we're going to talk a little bit about his escape from Richmond now, because obviously, you get to the point in 1865 where the net closes in. And would you like to tell us a story about Jefferson Davis' escape from Richmond? Because it's quite a great story, isn't it?
Not only is it a great story, there was an anniversary of 150 years to the date of this story that I'm about to tell you. The story starts in Richmond, and it's a Sunday morning, and Davis is walking between the White House and to St. Paul's Episcopal Church for service. He's very, very, very religious in this point of his time. And a gentleman approaches him with a telegram, and he puts it in his pocket. He's on his way to church. Well, look at this. But he does get in church. And during church services, midway through, another gentleman shows up with a telegram. Davis unreads it, reads it, and gets up and silently leaves the church. The telegram is from Robert E. Lee saying, Petersburg has fallen, evacuate Richmond. 150 years later, to the exact day, to the exact time, my wife and I are sitting in the same pew that Jefferson Davis did on that date. Now they're having an event here. There's 250 people. And I missed the opportunity because if I had have had my cell phone on, I could have had it ring in the middle of this thing and got up and silently walked out of the church and reenacted that same thing. But we were fortunate. We decided that we would do the flight. We followed Davis's steps 150 years later. We went from Richmond like he did to Danville. We spent a couple of days in Danville. We went to Greensboro, North Carolina. We went to Charlotte, North Carolina. interesting. Everywhere we went, we were open arms. Everybody was excited. We're reenacting this 150 years later until we got to Charlotte. Now, when he arrives in Charlotte, it's April the 16th or 17th, and he's giving a speech. And there's a monument in the sidewalk saying, "This is where Jefferson Davis received the telegram announcing Lincoln is dead. He has been shot." And it changes Davis's perspective. It's the last time he's really going to have a meeting with his cabinet. It's the last time that the government is really intact, because he realizes right then he's going to be the number one target. And he was.
Mm-hmm.
Stanton puts out a wanted poster for the death of Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, $100,000. His family had left weeks before him, and they were ahead of him. Now his whole goal is to see his family. So he's going to travel light from there on. He's going to get to a place called Abbeville, South Carolina, a little bitty town. He expected his family to be at the mansion that he told them to be. He walks in the door expecting to see them, but they had left about 4 days before. That's the last building that he holds a war conference with his remaining leaders. And he asks them, "Is there any hope?" And their answer is no. He gets up from the table to walk up the bed to upstairs to take a nap, and he looks back, and they say that's the first time that there were tears in his eyes. He then knew it was over, but he still wants to see his family. He takes off with an entourage of horsemen riding day and night, and in the middle of Georgia, he runs into a wagon train, and lo and behold, it's his family. His wife and the 5 kids. They had been traveling like that for over 40 days. He meets Verena, and she's ecstatic to see him. Hadn't seen him in a month and a half. They meet, and she said, "Goes on, keep going, because they're after you." He says, "No, I'm going to spend one more night with you." They end up in Erwinville, Georgia. The next morning, the Union arrives. There's gunfire. Davis comes out of the tent. As he comes out, Verena puts a shawl around him. It's a very moist, dewy day in Georgia in early May. And he goes outside, and what does he see? A Union soldier on a horse pointing a gun at him. Verena comes out of the tent and sees that immediately. She knows what he's thinking. Thinks he's 35 years old. He's going to reach up and grab that gun and get the guy off the horse, jump on the horse, and get away. Then Verena knows you're 56 years old, and you're not going to. And she runs out and gets between Jefferson and the Union soldier. If they don't meet up after this almost month and a half of separation in the middle of Georgia, Jefferson Davis is dead that day. I guarantee you he's going to be shot and be on the ground. But God had a plan for him to survive that.
Yes.
So that's the capture of Davis after that flight.
Okay. And then he does spend a long time in prison, I believe. Is that right? Because like you said, they try and, there's no one else. They haven't got anyone else to blame, have they? So they blame Jefferson Davis, don't they? So tell us about his time in prison and what he goes through there.
He and his family are taken to Savannah, where he's loaded on a boat, and he's taken to Fortress Monroe, Virginia. And he's in a casemate cell for the first 8 months or so of his imprisonment, with light 24 hours a day and soldiers next to him for 24 hours a day. Now, Jefferson Davis by now has got a really bad health. He's had bad health his whole life, but by now he's lost sight in his left eye. He's got neuralgia. There are times when he's president that he's in a dark room for a month at a time, still working. So he is in bad health at that time, but they finally move him to an apartment, but he's waiting for his bail bond hearing, which will not come until 1867.
Wow.
Ironically, the courtroom where the bail bond is held in Richmond, Virginia, the charges are treason. They tried Lincoln. That didn't work. They tried to have Andersonville. That didn't work. But treason's going to be the one. However, Simon B. Chase, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, says, be careful. If you try him, he may win. You have to realize he was appointed as provisional of the provisional country. There wasn't any instigation. He didn't create anything. And because of that, he didn't act as a treason. He was acting on behalf of the treasonous actions before. And so finally, they have a bail bond hearing, and the courtroom that they have it in is adjacent to his old office in Richmond. We've been to both places. It's ironic to stand there. And it's $100,000. That's $1.5 million today. And people like Cornelius Vanderbilt and Horace Greeley signed his bail bond, and he's finally released on bail.
What an amazing story. So he gets out of prison. So what's his later life like? What does he do? What does he get up to?
Well, he comes out to nothing. I mean, his house is Union land. He doesn't have any land. He doesn't have anything. He wanders around a lot. And interesting, he came to England quite a few times. Matter of fact, there's a place where he stayed in Scotland at a castle for like 3 weeks. I'm going to find that castle because I'm going to go ask him. I assure you the heirs are still there. Maybe I can go stay in this castle. But he's there a lot. What's interesting is we don't have any record of how. He didn't have any money. But he's not traveling in the back of the boat. He's well taken care of and treated very nicely. But he wants his day in court, even though his lawyers are telling him just to stay in England. So he comes back here, and by 1869, all charges are dropped, and he ends up in Memphis, Tennessee. He needs a job, and he goes to work for Carolina Insurance Company, one of the first Ponzi schemes ever created. They're selling life insurance to Confederate veterans. Just think about that for a few minutes, and you know it ain't going to work. But that's where he ends up. So he's there in Memphis, and by now they've had 6 kids, he and Verena. 3 of the boys die before 4, the 6th. One of them dies in Richmond during the war. He loses a son, just like Lincoln does. His oldest son of the 4 boys would be 20 years old, but he will die of yellow fever in Memphis, leaving him with only 2 daughters, Margaret and Verena Ann, who becomes Winnie. Margaret is in Memphis with him and falls in love with a gentleman by the name of Joel Addison Hayes. And she's going to marry him in 1876, and she becomes Margaret Davis Hayes. Jefferson's going to leave Memphis after the demise of the Carolina. He's going to go to Biloxi, Mississippi. Sarah Dorsey gives him kind of a good deal to live at Beauvoir. She leaves Beauvoir to him in his will, and that's his last home on the Gulf Coast. That's where he's going to live until 1889. Margaret Davis Hayes, in 1885, decides that she sees the reincarnation of the South. The Jim Crow era has started. And she sees that she's got the only descendants of the president, and she's worried about that. And her husband has bad health. So they moved to a little town in Colorado called Colorado Springs, Colorado in 1885. He's a banker. He's going to be fine. So they're going to be there. Jefferson is in Biloxi, but he comes to Vicksburg often because he's still got his land here. He finally got his land from his brother, has his plantation. In December of 1889, he comes up to look at the land. He gets pneumonia. He gets on a riverboat to get back to Biloxi, but he doesn't make it. And he gets to New Orleans, and he dies. Now we have Winnie, she's up in New England. She's already passed away. And we have Margaret and the kids. They have to come down from Colorado to New Orleans. I don't know this story until 20 years ago. I'm at a family reunion in Rosemont. And as I walk into the glade, everyone there knows who I am because I'm the president. But I don't know everybody that's there because they might have never been there once. Anyway, we walk into this glade, and there's this little short white-haired lady surrounded by an entourage. And she starts pointing at me. And I looked at my wife, Carol, and I said, "Who's that?" "I don't know. We need to go find out." So I walk up to her, and I get about a foot away, and she says, "Bertram, I'm your great Aunt Lucy." I haven't seen her for like 40 years, literally. Anyway, we visit for the weekend, and on Sunday afternoon, she says, "Do you know how you got your name?" And I said, "Sure I do." And she says, "No, you don't. My mother was in the room." And I said, "What room are you talking about?" When the Hayeses came down from Colorado Springs, they were in a hotel room in New Orleans. Across the street is Gallier Hall, where Jefferson Davis is lying in state. So she tells me the story that Verena's in the room looking at the kids going, Hayes, Hayes, Hayes. And she goes over and points out the window and said, there lies the last Davis. Isn't that a shame? Can't we do something about that? My grandfather is in the room. His name is Jefferson Addison Hayes. He's 3 years old. They ask him to change his name. What is he going to do? And they come up with a new one, Jefferson Hayes hyphen Davis. That's what keeps the name Davis in the family. So today, there's probably 100, 110 descendants of Jefferson Davis. But my lineage is the only one that carries the last name Hayes and the last name Davis.
Wow, awesome. What a lineage. Yeah, excellent. And so was his funeral quite a big thing, or and where is he where is he buried? And could you tell us that?
His funeral was the largest funeral still today in the South. There were 100,000 people in New Orleans for his funeral. He was buried in New Orleans, but every state wanted him. Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama. But Virginia came to Verena 2 years later and said, here's the deal. We're going to give you an entire plot in Hollywood Cemetery. We're going to call it Davis Circle. You can entomb your husband and you and all your kids. And for descendants, for as far as the eye can see, it will be their resting place. And so she moved him there, collected all the dead kids, moved them there, and there have been generations of others been buried there. And if whenever I do succumb and they bury me, I'm going to be buried at Richmond in Hollywood Cemetery. I have my plot all picked out.
Awesome. Anyway, yeah, that's amazing, amazing. I've got goosebumps right now talking about this stuff because it's just amazing. So, what is his legacy and remembrance? What would you say there, Bertram?
That's a good question, and it's very interesting about how I got to know him. I grew up in Colorado, and Jefferson Davis has zero value in Colorado, no importance whatsoever. But I went to school, graduate school at the University of Alabama. And when I was there, a lady called me and said, Bertram, we want you to come make a speech about your great-great-grandfather at the first White House rededication in Montgomery. And I said yes, and I hung up the phone. And then I realized something. I don't know anything about him. There's a painting on the wall. The books are on the bookcase. My grandfather and great aunts knew their great-great-grandfather. You would think I'd know everything there is, but I know nothing. So I wrote a speech, and this is before the internet, so you go out and get a couple of biographies, and I write this speech, and I think it's going to be a real small ceremony, like maybe like 20 people. I get to Montgomery, and there's 500 people, including Governor George Wallace. So I'm at Montgomery, Alabama, and I get out of my car, and I'm already scared because I don't know anything about him, and I've never been to talk. And then I see 500 people, including a governor, and I'm just petrified. But I get up to the podium, and I make this speech, and I'm ready to leave. I'm going to get out of there. Well, what do they do? Can you see this?
Yes.
That's me giving a speech. And right over here is Governor George Wallace in his wheelchair. You see him?
Mm-hmm.
I've never been next to a governor. Right at the end of the speech, Governor Wallace reaches over and grabs me by the arm, and he says, you're really a descendant of Jefferson Davis. And I said, yes, I am. He says, why don't you spend the rest of the day with me? Well, that's a pretty big deal, being with a governor. I've never been with a governor. So we do. We spend the rest of the day. I don't know what we did. At the end of it, he says, I've got to leave now, but if you ever get back to Montgomery, you come see me. And I'm going, right, you're a governor. You're not going to have time for me. 3 months later, I'm back in Montgomery. And I said, I'm going to see how this works. I walk up the Capitol, walk in the governor's office, and I said, hello, I'm here to see the governor. He asked me who I was. I said, I'm Bertram Hayes Davis. She says, just a minute. She gets on the phone and dials up, and she says, Bertram Hayes Davis is here to... And that's as far as she gets. The chief of staff comes through the door like I'm a long lost relative, saying, "Bertram, come back on in. George is glad to see you." And I spent another 2 hours with George. Now, I don't know what we did, but what I did find out is, I'm a Davis. I'm a Davis, the only president I have standing I don't know about. I mean, it's a big deal in the South. And so I had a decision to make. I could either do like my dad, he made one speech and then go back to Colorado, or I could learn something about it. So we've spent about, I don't know, an hour almost talking about him or less than that. But everywhere that I've talked about, except for Mexico and England, I've been there. I've stood there, and I know what he was when he was there. So we live in Vicksburg right now. I'm on a street a half a block from some of the friends of his that he would see. I go to some of the places. Every day I walk the streets and I walk in his hometown in his very footsteps.
Wow, that is so awesome. You must be so proud of that lineage and that history.
Not only are we proud, we're very fortunate. I've talked about Jefferson for 40 years all over. I started with two people in a living room and whatever, and I went to national conferences, and you can YouTube and see some of my talks. But we're very fortunate. I was asked to become a lecturer on the riverboats. We have riverboats that run up and down the Mississippi River. So I did that for many years, and I talked about Jefferson Davis a lot on those riverboats. That's people want to know about that. But when we moved to Vicksburg, Mississippi, we decided we could do more than just that lecture. So now we have contracts with all of these riverboats that stop in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and we bring them. I lead a tour of Vicksburg and get to talk about Jefferson Davis about 5 times a week. Last year, we did somewhere around 3,000 people. This year, we'll probably do more like 5,000 people that I'm giving the opportunity to tell a little more about my great-great-grandfather.
Awesome. What a great thing to do. And so as far as because you said that he obviously lived for time in Vicksburg, is the property where he lives still around, or because obviously do you live in the property that he lived in or anything like that?
His land was south of town on a bend in the river. It was called Davis Bend. In 1868, the river cut it off and became Davis Island in the middle of the Mississippi. You can Google it and see it.
Yeah.
The land itself went through a lot of changes, and Joseph never deeded it to him. He had to come back in 1870 and fight to get his land back. So the property that was there for Jefferson Davis and his home was owned by the family until 1952. The house that he built survived the war. But unfortunately, in 1935 or thereabouts, there was a fire and it got burned to the ground. However, my grandfather, because it's in the middle of the river, raised it up on brick columns to keep the water out during the spring floods. So I go over to Davis Island 2 or 3 times a year. I can go anytime I want. The owners love us. And I know exactly where the house was because the bricks are right there where the house was. So, yes, the property is still there. It's owned by friends of ours, and we do visit often.
Awesome. That's excellent. Okay, so I'm going to change the topic now. So is there any really good books out there or movies or documentaries that people could read or watch that tell the story of Jefferson Davis if they wanted to do research into him?
There are 4 or 5 major biographies done. The titles are Jefferson Davis by various authors. They're all extremely good, but they're very lengthy. They're about 700 or 800 pages, but I can't say one of them's better than the other. I've read them all. I know all the authors. The one book that's kind of fascinating that's just come out is one about Verena called Verena, and it talks about her life and being married to Jefferson Davis. It's quite eye-opening in reference to her particular part of his life. But any biography of Jefferson Davis is recommended by me.
Excellent. And any last thoughts before we wrap up this podcast, Bertram?
Well, I think it's important for the world to recognize that this is one of the most misunderstood and misrepresented historic figures. I mean, he lost the war, and because you're a loser, And yet today, even as far as maybe a week ago, he's on national television. He's portrayed as an evil person. Because we have this political divide in our country, they're trying to align some of the candidates with Jefferson Davis and paint Jefferson Davis as a very evil person. So I'm struggling with the fact that people only look at one negative and forget all the positives. We do that throughout our historic venture. It's no different than anywhere else in the world. But remember, all these folks, including Davis, had so much good in them and did so many good things that certainly those have to be considered when we look at the entire picture. I say take another look. It's the lens of perspective that you look at the individual, not in this time, but in his time.
That is a great point, honestly, and that is a great way to finish the podcast. So, Bertram Hayes Davis, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it. Cheers.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
See you all soon, everyone. A big thank you to our guest, Bertram Hayes Davis. Remember, you can find links to our website podcasts as well as our social media pages in the show's description. A massive shout out and thank you to Cody C. Engdahl, who performed and allowed us to use his piece of violin music, Bonnie Blue Flag. Not only is Cody a musician, but he's also an author of a series of fictional novels set during the American Civil War. You will find links to Cody's books in the show's description. Alternatively, you will find them on Amazon. And in Cody's latest book, he steps out of the American Civil War and into the Austro-Prussian War, The Prussian Prince, which you can also find via Amazon. All that's left to say is thank you very much for listening and watching The Figures of the American Civil War podcast. Cheers.